All right, welcome back to AI Paper Podcasts. Today we're diving into a really interesting paper on composed image retrieval. You know, CIR.
Yeah, CIR. It's a hot topic.
Definitely. So for the short form folks listening, here's a quick rundown. This paper introduces CoLLM. It's a new way to handle CIR using large language models to really understand the link between a starting image and like a text edit.
Right. Finding the right picture based on another picture plus some text instructions.
Exactly. They found existing methods weren't quite cutting it, so they used LLMs for a better understanding. And they built this huge new data set, multi-text CIR, or MTCIR.
Plus, they cleaned up some existing benchmarks, CIR and Fashion IQ. And the bottom line, CoLLM seems to work significantly better. That's the gist.
That's the gist. So, if you're sticking around for the deep dive, let's unpack this properly. CIR, composed image retrieval. Give us that concrete example again.
Sure. Imagine you've got a photo, say, of a white dog. Simple enough. You want to find a picture of that dog, or one very like it, but wearing a little hat.
Okay, so reference image, white dog, modification text, wearing a hat, target image, white dog with a hat.
Precisely. And this kind of task is, well, it's becoming super important, especially in areas like e-commerce, fashion.
Yeah.
Anywhere, visual search needs to be more nuanced.
Right, but as you hinted, and as the paper points out, current methods often struggle a bit.
They do. One big issue is how they learn the connection between the image and the text change. Often they just rely on standard image-caption pairs, which doesn't really teach the model how to modify things compositionally.
It's like knowing dog and hat, but not understanding dog wearing a hat.
Exactly. And then there's the data they learn from. A lot of the existing synthetic data sets, the ones with triplets, reference text, target, they can lack diversity. Or the modification text sounds, well, pretty unnatural.
Yeah, robotic sometimes.
Kind of. Or they're small. Or even closed source, which isn't great for research. And the models themselves, often they're using like shallower transformer models or just sort of linearly blending features.
Which doesn't capture the complexity.
Right. They often lack the deep understanding needed to really figure out what the modification text means in relation to the image.
Okay, so that sets the stage. The limitations are clear. How does this paper with CoLLM tackle this?
So CoLLM stands for Composed Language Image Model. And the core idea is pretty fundamental. Leverage the power of large language models.
Okay.
Instead of just shallow models or simple feature mixing, they're tapping into the vast world knowledge and semantic understanding baked into these pre-trained LLMs. The argument is that these models are inherently better at grasping the tricky relationship between the reference image and the modification text.
That makes intuitive sense. LLMs have seen so much text, they understand concepts and relationships better. The paper also mentions LMMs, large language embedding models. How are they different?
Good question. So LMMs are still LLMs, but they're often specialized. They're fine-tuned specifically for creating really good text embeddings representations, basically often for tasks like text retrieval. Sometimes their architecture is even tweaked slightly, like maybe disabling the text generation part or modifying attention mechanisms, all to get higher quality embeddings for matching and similarity tasks. Think of them as LLMs honed for retrieval.
Got it. So CoLLM uses these powerful language models. How does it actually process the input? You mentioned they don't just use raw image caption pairs.
Right, this is where their augmentation strategy comes in. And it's quite novel. It has two main parts, reference image embedding synthesis and modification text synthesis.
Okay, let's break down the first one, reference image embedding synthesis.
So you take an image embedding, let's call it HI. The model looks within its current training batch and finds the embedding of the most visually similar image, HI, using cosine similarity.
Finding its closest neighbor, visually speaking.
Exactly. Then it uses something called spherical linear interpolation, or SLIP.
SLIRP.
To essentially blend HI and HJ. This creates a new synthetic reference image embedding, let's call it HI. There's a knob, a hyperparameter alpha, that controls how much it blends, how close the synthetic version stays to the original HI.
Okay, and the intuition there is?
The idea is that this synthesized embedding, HI, now shares some visual DNA with the target image you're ultimately trying to find because it's been blended with a similar image. It helps the model learn about variations and subtle changes. A higher alpha keeps it closer to the original reference, good for learning subtle tweaks.
Clever. Showing it in between states, almost. What about the second part? Modification text synthesis.
So for that same original image, VIA, we found its nearest neighbor, VJ, which also has a caption, WJ. To create a synthetic modification text, the VIA, they don't just use the original caption Y. Instead, they combine Y and WJ using specific templates.
Templates, like what?
Things like show original caption instead of neighbor's caption, or maybe original caption but without some element from neighbor's caption. The paper has a few examples. The point is to generate text that actually describes a change or difference between the two images.
Why not just use the target image's caption way?
Well, the authors argue that Y alone doesn't really explain the modification from the reference. Using just Y might even encourage the model to ignore the reference image and just focus on matching the caption, kind of like cheating the task.
Right, you need the description of the change.
Precisely. This synthesis method forces the model to grapple with both the reference visual and the textual description of the difference, which is much closer to how real CIR queries work.
Okay, so we have a synthesized reference image embedding, way, and a synthesized modification text, way. What happens next?
The model then creates 3 different query embeddings using these synthesized inputs. First, an image-only query embedding, just based on RO. Second, a text-only query embedding, based just on WAR. And third, the main event, the composed query embedding. This is generated by feeding both the synthesized image embedding and the synthesized text into the LLM, structured using a specific instruction template.
An instruction template?
Yeah, they mention using one like, instruct, find the image that matches the query. Query, image. Image embedding text, modification text. This guides the LLM to perform the CIR task.
Got it. So 3 types of queries based on the synthesized inputs. How does it learn from these?
It uses a contrastive loss function. The basic idea of contrastive loss is to pull representations of matching items closer together in the embedding space while pushing representations of non-matching items further apart.
Learning to distinguish the correct target.
Exactly. It calculates this loss for each of the 3 query types, image-only, text-only composed, against the actual target image embedding. The final training loss is simply the average of these 3 losses. This encourages the model to create representations that are consistent and discriminative, whether it's looking at just the image, just the text, or the combination.
That sounds like a robust way to train it. Now, you mentioned they also built a new dataset, MTCIR. Why was that necessary?
Well, like we discussed, existing datasets often had issues, lack of diversity, unnatural language, sometimes small scale. To really push CIR forward, especially with a powerful model like CoLLM, you need better, bigger, more realistic data. That was the motivation for multi-text CIR.
So how did they build MTCIR? What makes it different?
They started with images from the LLVA 558K dataset. This itself is curated for broad concept coverage, so it's a diverse base of real images, not synthetic ones.
Okay, real images, good start.
Then they paired these images based on visual similarity using CLI bendings, similar to how the CIR dataset was constructed. This resulted in a huge number of pairs, about 3.4 million pairs from over 400,000 images.
Wow, okay. 3.4 million, that's substantial.
It is, but the really innovative part is the multi-text aspect.
Oh.
For each image pair, say image A and image B, they didn't just get one text describing the change from A to B.
Right, you mentioned that.
They used detailed captions available for these images, and then employed another powerful LLM, Claude 3 Sonnet, to generate 3 different modification texts for each pair.
3 texts. Why 3?
These texts were generated hierarchically. So one might be a coarse, high-level description of the change, the next adds a bit more detail, and the third is even finer grained.
Ah, like different levels of specificity.
Exactly. This gives you more natural language variation and different levels of detail, which is great for training a model to understand diverse instructions. It better reflects how people might actually describe changes.
That's a really smart approach. More natural, more flexible training data.
And it makes MTCIR, as they state, the largest publicly available data set for CIR right now. That's a big contribution to the community, allowing others to build on this work.
Definitely. And they mentioned data privacy measures too.
Yes, crucial point. They applied face blurring to all images and also filtered out text content containing keywords related to sensitive human attributes, skin color, gender, age, race, etc. Responsible data handling.
Good. Did they measure how diverse MTCIR actually is?
They did. They used methods like RAM visual tags and spacey text tokens to analyze it.
Yeah.
And compared to other data sets like CR, LASCO, CC Core, MTCIR came out on top with the highest number of unique visual concepts and text tokens.
So it's quantifiably more diverse.
Seems so. They even did quality checks on the generated modification texts using models like GPT-4o and DeepSeek V3, asking them if the text accurately described the change. Apparently, a very high percentage of the sampled texts were rated as good.
Okay, so a big, diverse, high-quality data set. But they didn't stop there, right? They also refined existing benchmarks.
Correct. They tackle CIR and Fashion IQ. The goal was to clean them up, ensuring only genuinely good, unambiguous samples remained for evaluation.
How did they refine them? Sounds like a careful process.
It was a three-step pipeline. Steps 1 and 3 were about validation. They used Claude Sonnet again. For a given sample, reference image, mod text, target image, they showed the model, the reference, the text, the correct target, and also several visually similar but incorrect target images, hard negatives.
Testing its ability to pick the right one from distractors.
Exactly. They asked the LLM to pick the correct target. They did this multiple times for each sample, shuffling the order of the candidates. To pass validation, the LLM had to pick the right one consistently, like at least 2 out of 3 times. Samples where the LLM refused to answer, maybe due to content filters, were also removed.
Okay, that sounds pretty strict. What was step 2?
Step 2 was for samples that failed the initial validation, maybe because the modification text was ambiguous. Instead of just throwing them out, they used Claude Sonnet 3 to regenerate the modification text.
Fixing the ambiguity.
Right. They gave the model the original triplet, reference, bad text, target, and also some examples of good validated samples for context. Then they asked it to generate 3 new candidate modification texts, again with that course-defined structure. The best one, after being validated itself, replaced the original ambiguous text.
Wow, that's quite an effort to improve the benchmarks, not just filter them.
It really is. It makes the benchmarks more reliable for evaluating how well models really understand nuanced modifications. And again, they applied the same biometric info removal to these refined benchmarks.
And the upshot, did CoLLM do better on these refined versions?
Yes, consistently. The paper shows CoLLM outperforming other methods on these refined benchmarks, often by a larger margin than on the originals. This suggests CoLLM is particularly good at handling the more subtle or complex modifications that remain after the refinement.
Interesting. So the refinement highlights CoLLM's strengths even more?
Especially, they note, the gap widened between a baseline model, BLAPL, trained on MTCIR, and CoLLM, also trained on MTCIR, when tested on the refined SAR benchmark. It really underscores CoLLM's advantage in understanding nuanced changes when the evaluation data is cleaner.
Okay, let's talk concrete results. How did CoLLM stack up overall on the benchmarks?
Pretty impressively, across Circo, SIRR, and Fashion IQ, using various standard visual backbones like CLIP and BA-LIP, CoLLM generally landed as either the top performing or second best performing method compared to prior state-of-the-art models that hadn't been trained on large triplet datasets like MTCIR.
And the pre-training on MTCIR itself made a big difference.
Oh, absolutely. The results clearly show that models pre-trained on MTCIR significantly outperformed counterparts trained only on image-caption data. It really validates the benefit of having that large-scale, targeted triplet data.
Did they experiment with those internal parameters like the slurp blending factor, alpha?
They did ablation studies, yeah. They found that setting alpha to 0.5 for the slurp interpolation and applying their modification text synthesis to about 75% of the training samples seemed to give the best performance. So some tuning was involved.
And what about the choice of LLM? Did the specialized LMs outperform general LLMs?
Yes, that was another finding. Models like E5 Mistral 7B Inst and SFR Embedding 2, which are LMs fine-tuned for text retrieval tasks, generally did better on CIR than their base LLM versions. It supports the idea that models optimized for embedding quality excel here.
Makes sense. Any other interesting observations from the experiments?
Well, they noted something about training BLEPL, which is a strong vision language model, on a smaller dataset called LASCO. Apparently, it started overfitting very quickly, like after just one epoch.
Suggesting that for these powerful models, you really need large, diverse datasets like MTCIR to prevent them from just memorizing the training data.
Exactly. It highlights the importance of dataset scale and quality for effective training and generalization.
You mentioned earlier the 3 query types, image-only, text-only, and composed. How do they perform individually?
This was one of the more surprising findings, actually. On both the original and especially the refined benchmarks, after training, The text-only queries sometimes achieved remarkably high performance.
Just using the modification text without the reference image, that seems counterintuitive for CIR.
It does. The authors speculate this might indicate that even in the refined benchmarks, there might be some remaining cases where the text description is so distinctive, or the visual difference between the target and negatives is so clear based on the text alone that the reference image becomes less crucial. Or perhaps the paired images sometimes have an inherent text bias.
So the text becomes the dominant signal.
Potentially, in some cases, they flag this as a really interesting area for future work thinking about benchmark design and how to ensure the compositional aspect, image plus text, is truly necessary and tested.
Fascinating. It suggests there's still more to understand about how these models work and how we evaluate them. Did they show examples of the refinement?
Yes, the paper includes figures showing examples of bad samples from the original benchmarks that were ambiguous, and then the regenerated, clearer modification texts produced by their pipeline. It helps visualize the kinds of improvements they made.
And they categorize the types of modifications in MTCIR too.
Right. They define 6 main categories, like changing attributes, adding objects, removing objects, relationship changes, viewpoint changes, number changes. They analyzed how common each type was in their MTCIR dataset, giving a better picture of the kinds of transformations it covers.
Okay, so wrapping things up. This CoLLM paper seems like a really solid step forward for composed image retrieval.
I think so. The key takeaways are really the novel architecture using LLMs effectively for that composed understanding, and the huge contribution of the MTCIR dataset. It's large, diverse, and publicly available.
And the refinement of the existing benchmarks is also important for the whole field, providing a more reliable way to measure progress.
Definitely. This kind of work has real potential to make image search much more powerful and intuitive, especially for complex visual queries in areas like online shopping.
Absolutely. So, to leave our listeners with something to chew on, that surprising result about text-only queries performing well.
Right.
What does that really tell us about how well current visual embeddings capture these compositional changes? Are they still missing something fundamental? And looking forward, how do we bridge that gap? What kind of new data augmentations or maybe even architectural changes are needed so that the model truly needs both the image and the text to solve the task reliably?
That's the big question, isn't it? How do we ensure we're truly evaluating compositional understanding?
Lots to think about there. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for tuning into this deep dive on AI paper podcasts.